Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. Before we get started in earnest today, if you are within the sound of my voice and you have not yet pre-ordered The Soul of Wealth on Amazon, I'd encourage you to go and do that. You can go back a few episodes and look at some of the sample chapters I published through this very podcast. Thank you to the thousands of people who have pre-ordered. We appreciate your support. So on to the real meat and the substance of why we're here today. My guest today is Andy Baxley, a financial planner with the Planning Center, who's based in Chicago. He, alongside Carl Richards and Jeremy Walter, has created something very cool recently, something that immediately caught my attention. It's a course dedicated to helping advisors assist their clients in articulating and pursuing their financial purpose, and he's here to talk to us all about that today. Andy, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, Daniel. I cannot think of a better place to have this conversation than the Standard Deviations podcast. So excited to be here.
This is the place. This is the place. So before we get started, have you eaten at Kasama in Chicago?
You know, I've been to Kasama a few times now. I was delighted to learn recently that it's only about a 10-minute drive from my office. And so we hired an associate advisor recently. And so she and I have been sneaking away for lunch at Kasama during the week, which you don't have a line at lunch during a weekday. And that's about the only time you don't have a line. So yes, I have, and we'll be back.
Okay. So when I come to Chicago, we're going. It is the first ever Michelin star Filipino restaurant in the world. I'm a big fan. So I've been dying to get to Chicago just for that and can't seem to make it there. So we are here today to talk about what is candidly my favorite thing in the world to talk about, which is purpose. We're going to talk about it. Most of the research and thinking that I do about this is in the sort of the broader context of life. We're going to talk about it today in a more explicitly financial context. But I was thrilled to see that the three of you came out with this course. I think it's so necessary. I think this is a time, we talked a little bit about this before we hit record. This is a time in American history and perhaps even world history, a time of great abundance, but limited wisdom and meaning in some respects. Professor Vervaeke has written and talked about this a lot. Like if you ask people, where do you go to find information, right? Like we've got the world's information in our pocket. But if you ask people, where do you go to find wisdom or purpose and meaning? They kind of go, oh. So we have more information than ever before, but we don't always have good partners in walking the path of taking that information and combining it into something a little bit more meaningful. So the first question around this, I really like what Michael Kitces and your co-author Carl Richards have done on their podcast. They've talked a great deal about how little access most people have to their financial purpose and even their financial goals when they're asked initially. And they sort of, I hope I'm paraphrasing them well here. They sort of say, look, when most people are asked, like, what are your goals? What's your purpose with this money? They do one of a couple of things, right? They give you some vague answer about wanting more, right? Or they give you some round number, like I want $1 million that they kind of pulled from the air. Or they give you something highly mimetic, right? Like, oh, my neighbor just got a boat, so I would also like a boat. Why do you think it is that we as a human family seem to have such limited access to really what we want from a financial perspective?
Well, it's such an important point. And if you want to have a really awkward conversation, just go up to somebody on the street and ask them what their financial purpose is. You'll get blank stares and not a lot of great answers, at least not initially. And I think I would take a step back and say, how often do we even think about purpose, period, let alone how it relates to money? who are we having these big picture conversations with? Some of us are fortunate enough to have somebody in our lives that we can, but very seldomly, I think, is that the case. And I think in our culture, especially, money's often vilified either as a necessary evil, in which case we avoid talking about it as much as possible, or it's glorified. It's treated like an ends in and of itself rather than a means. And so we assume that the purpose behind our money is, like you said, just simply to get more of it. So in this case, we might talk about money all the time, but the conversation's lacking something very important in that case, which is this question, why? And I will just add, I think that the financial services community more broadly has to take some responsibility here for why these conversations haven't happened as much in our circles. And, I think largely we've trained clients to think that our value lies solely in investment selection, rebalancing, providing that semi-annual market update. And it's not to say those things aren't valuable, right? But they represent, I think, a very small percentage of the really great value that an advisor can provide to a client.
I like your point there. I do feel like we fall down on sort of either end of that, right? Like the vilification or the deification of money, right? Like either it's bad and it's nasty and it's this necessary evil and we're jealous of people who have it, or it becomes sort of all consuming. And I do think there's a lot of empty calories around money, right? We're always sort of talking about money in an implicit or an explicit way, but it's not always very substantive. Like that conversation around money is kind of surfacey, and I don't think we get very deep in this. You have a great definition. You believe that the sort of essence of financial planning is done when we align capital and purpose. I like that. That's a real easy way to think about it. Financial planning is the alignment of capital and purpose. Can you break that idea down for us a bit more? Tell us where it came from and why you think it's so important.
Yeah, it came from Carl Richards, who worked with us on creating this course. And I think it's important to come to terms on what we mean by capital when we say the word capital, because for me, and I know for Carl, it's not just about financial capital. He has this definition that I love. He says, capital is our money, our time, our energy, and our attention. I've also heard talent thrown in there as well, which I also love. And time, energy, and attention, those really are our most precious and limited resources. And the choices we make with our money has a really significant impact on all three. There's this amazing quote that I love from the writer Annie Dillard. She says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So when we think about capital in this more holistic way, we begin to see that aligning capital and purpose is really about spending our days well. It's about creating lives that are wholly and uniquely our own. And I don't think we should take for granted that the choices we make in these areas will automatically be wholly and uniquely our own, because, as you know, Daniel, and I think as you've written about, our social context has so much power over us when it comes to these big decisions around resource allocation.
How do you work? I really like this broader definition of capital. Do you introduce that directly to your clients? Do you try to get them to conceptualize this idea of capital in a broader way, and why? Like, what's the impact on their lives if you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. The wonderful thing about being an acolyte of Carl's is that he's provided us with all these wonderful and very simple drawings. And so the one that he has, he calls them sketches. The sketch he has that explains this one is effectively a Venn diagram, right? And so on one of the circles is your use of capital, and the other one is what's important to you. And then in the middle of that is real financial planning, the intersection of that. And so I do use that with clients. I basically say, my purpose as your advisor is to help you live the best possible version of your life that you can, and to use money as a tool to do that. And so I do set the stage with clients on that. And we may talk about this later, but that helps a little bit when you bring up some of these deeper conversations. It helps a little bit when you might otherwise have gotten sort of a quizzical look, like, why is this guy talking to me about this stuff? I think it helps a little bit to headline that conversation and put it in the context of what we think of as our broader purpose as advisors.
Yeah. So I want to do a little bit of a two-parter with this next question. First, I think we need to before we kind of get into the substance of how we articulate and tease this out for clients, I want to talk about, goals, values, and purpose, because I've seen different sort of experts in the industry sort of place these in different places and say that one is sort of a necessary prerequisite for another. How would you tease apart and differentiate goals, values, and purpose? And do they need to be highlighted in a certain order? Is one sort of more fundamental than the other?
That's such a good question. I can't say that we have the right answer. I don't know if there is the right answer, but we have thought about this. And the process that we teach advisors is a 3-step process. It starts with values, which then goes into purpose. And then we call the third section action, which I think is synonymous with goals, right? It's taking action on those goals. So I do think values are a really good place to start. And the way I think about this, I think of values as being the ingredients that then come together in this really amazing alchemy to then inform and create your sense of purpose. But I like to start with values. I think of purpose as sort of this overarching umbrella over all of our lives, and values being the ingredients that we need to clearly articulate before we can arrive at that purpose. And I do think both of those are important to discuss before we get to goals, which isn't to say a client may have a goal clearly articulated coming into the relationship, and we certainly want to honor those. But before we take action on any goals or before we give any recommendations, I think it's worth doing some more digging to see how we might either need to modify that original goal or perhaps uncover some goals that the client didn't even know existed.
When it comes to values, this is perhaps a deeply cynical shrink question. I'm going to try and be less cynical. But when it comes to values, what it has been my experience that people's stated values often differ dramatically from the way they spend their time and treasure, right? Look, I pick on myself here, right? I think there's people tend to highlight sort of lofty things, spirituality, fitness, family, all this stuff. But then if you look at sort of the calculus of their lives, like that doesn't always line up. And I even have a chapter in my new book about, basically like your budget is a pretty strong predictor of what you value. Like look at how you spend your time, look at how you spend your money, and like those are your values. Now, not kind of what you say they are. How do you get past this? Do you see this sort of social desirability or this disconnect when you're trying to get people to articulate those values? And how can we get people to be honest about what they truly care about?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because I think you're right. I think there is some, I've heard it put a little bit differently. It's like, show me your checkbook and show me your calendar and I'll tell you what you truly value. And to some extent that's true, but I push back on the idea a little bit because I think what it also tells you is what your society values. It might not really tell you what that person values. It might tell you, again, what their social context values. I believe most people have deeply felt values that aren't often realized in the real world, but it doesn't make them any less real to that person. And it doesn't make it any less important to uncover those and try to move in the direction of living in accordance with those values. I think there are a number of questions one can use to get at these values. The 4 that we teach advisors to use with clients are: number 1, describe your perfect day in vivid detail. Where are you? What are you doing? Who are you with? That's a question I got from Dimensional Fund advisors at a conference a while back. Number 2, how do you define success in this chapter of your life? Number 3, when it comes to your personal and financial life, what do you need in order to feel secure? And then finally, imagining you're in the final hours of a rich and fulfilling life. From that vantage point, how would you describe a life well lived? And so, these answers to these questions, and we try to approach that question of values in multiple ways, are going to be those more aspirational, lofty values. And then to follow that up, we do an exercise, which I think is we created a workbook that advisors can use to walk through with clients. I think this is the most challenging page. It's where once we've identified those values, we essentially have clients give a score of how closely aligned their current reality is with that value. And, in what ways is it aligned and in what ways isn't it? that can be a really exposing, vulnerable conversation for all of us. I eat what I cook. I've gone through the exercises myself, and some of my scores were, 3 or 4 in some areas. And so you have to ask those really hard questions of, what do I need to do to increase that score so that I really am living in accordance with what I value? So again, I think those values are important, even if they're not necessarily realized in the real world. Our job as advisors is to nudge our clients to living more in accordance with those values.
Yeah, I like that. So take them at their word that a stated value is a true value, which is a different conversation than it being a lived value. And part of it is highlighting the tension between, these purported values and the way they're being lived out in daily life, and helping design a financial life that will, facilitate a more fulsome living of those values. So now you have sort of the raw materials. You've used those questions are fantastic. You've used those questions to kind of give you the raw materials of these values. How do you then take the values and sort of transmute that into a statement of financial purpose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on the client, I will say. So one thing that I found is helpful is I'll show clients examples of other statements of financial purpose and say, here's what this might look like. I'll share my own and how I arrived at it. And that can be really helpful to get the client's wheels turning. But I think at this intersection, it's really important to recognize how the client thinks. Some clients are really going to benefit from thinking through what a statement of financial purpose might look and sound like with their advisor as a thinking partner. Others will do much better if you just give it to them as homework and say, here's some examples of what this might look like. Take the conversation we had today, come up with something that feels true to you or to you and your partner, and then come back to me next time with it and we'll talk about it. The important thing is giving the client enough scaffolding so that it's a term from teaching. I used to be a teacher. So giving them enough scaffolding so that it's not too big of a leap to go from that conversation about values into defining a statement of financial purpose. And again, providing some examples, providing some prompts, really, like a prompt, for example, would be the purpose of money in our lives is blank, right? And you just simply finish that sentence. So when you provide that scaffolding, I find clients come up with some really great answers.
Yeah. So Carl has, I'm a big fan of Carl's, and he's shared his financial purpose statement a number of times online. And it's something like spending time with people I love, mostly outside, or something, something to that effect. Yeah. What is yours, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so mine is money's purpose in our lives is to enable opportunities for growth and to deepen our connection to the people we love. So my wife and I are big lifelong learners, and we want our kids to be that way as well. And like most people, we just want to be around in a meaningful way the people we care about as much as possible. And so, when the decision comes up of, do we use this batch of money on vacations this year to go see family and friends, or do we buy that cool new Tesla SUV that I've got my eye on? It becomes pretty clarifying. We revisit that statement of financial purpose and remind ourselves what this is all for. Mm-hmm. I still want the Tesla SUV, but
Right. But money's a scarce resource, and hey, if there's enough money to get the Tesla and also prioritize family and loved ones, then why not? But it does give you a bit of a hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went into the year. With sort of 3 statements of like 3 words for the year. They were community, meaning, and no. I wanted to say more to, I wanted to say no to sort of lower quality distractions. I wanted to focus on a deep study of meaning and purpose, which is lovely to have you here, right? And I wanted to do things that foster community. And it's incredible how many times I've been brought to a decisional crossroads this year. Like, should I or shouldn't I? And it's like, well, this would build community. Let's do it, Mm-hmm. And, it's incredible how a simple signpost like that in your life can help you when you're faced with the family vacation and the Tesla. I think that's great. So
I'm curious, Daniel, do you keep those words visible anywhere? How do you keep them front of mind?
So, well, there's a bathroom right there, and I have a poster in there with all my with all my gym goals and my, my financial goals and my savings goals. And my dad, I grew up, my dad is a financial advisor. And so I grew up in a house where when I was a kid, he was maniacally focused on paying off our home. And so he would have a sort of simple line drawing of a house that was broken out into little blocks of however many thousands of dollars he needed to pay it off. And it sat in his closet, and he would color it in every time he would send in a payment. So I ate a lot of rice and beans I had a lot of rice and beans when I was a kid so my dad could pay off the house. But I really have picked that up from him and try and keep that front of mind.
Yeah, that's great.
So you use these values to sort of articulate the foundation of the house, right? The purpose then is sort of the rocket fuel, the big, hairy, audacious goal that gets you excited about it. And then the goals then are the action steps to use your nomenclature. The action steps are sort of the tactical specifics of how it gets implemented. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Makes a ton of sense to me. So, well, I want to know just selfishly, right? Because this is a question that I get all the time. Because at Orion, we're really trying to pioneer the use of behavioral tech. We are baking human-first ideas into our tech stack in a meaningful way. And we've got things like assessments that will help you understand how you and your partner, how your financial values are the same or they're different. We've got behaviorally informed risk tolerance questionnaires and all these other things. And I'd say 90% of the time, people, it's a breath of fresh air, right? People are excited to talk about these things. And then there's 10% of the time where it's like, hey, we'd like for you and your spouse to have a conversation about your financial values and your money styles. And they're like, wait a minute, just allocate my assets, bud. What do you do for advisors who are scared that, maybe this is a bridge too far? Or like, what would you say to clients or advisors who say, hey, this isn't really what I'm paying you for. Pick some good stocks for me.
I'm so glad you asked this question because this is a real thing for sure. And I think it's a real blocker for a lot of advisors. Like you said, advisors, sometimes they just want to stay in their lane, whatever that even means. And we can talk about that. They want to stay in their lane, or maybe they feel some sort of imposter syndrome when they start asking these sorts of questions. And there's just that fear that they're going to ask it. And the client's going to be like, hey, don't go there. Nope, no thanks. So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I would just say that fear sometimes feels really, really big. And then you actually go into practice and you start having these conversations with clients and you realize that it's actually a pretty small percentage of clients who really don't want to go there. And I would say if you're an advisor who does want to go there, maybe that's not the right client for you. Maybe that client would be better served by the thousands of advisors out there who are happy just to do the quantitative stuff. So that's the first thing I would say. But, I think this really goes back to the way that the industry has trained not only clients, but also advisors to think about this sort of thing, that this just isn't in our purview, these types of conversations. But if we're willing to acknowledge that these kinds of big picture questions are at least important, we have to ask, if we're not going to guide our clients through these conversations, who is? Who out there in the world? It's not going to be, their doctor. It's not going to be their priest. You might have conversations about meaning and purpose with certain people, but who's going to intersect that with money? But I just have to say, personally, I'm kind of done staying in my lane, at least as it's been defined historically by the industry. I think we're at this really exciting inflection point where we're redefining what that lane looks like, and the quantitative aspects of what we do are very quickly becoming commoditized and automated. And what's left after that automation happens, I think it's these types of conversations. And the successful advisor of the future, I think, is the one who has the ability to guide clients skillfully through those big picture conversations around meaning and purpose. So I guess to give you a more practical answer, going back to your question, I think the easiest way to avoid that look that you might get from a client around this is not what I'm paying for is to prime the pump a bit to make sure that the client understands before they even hire you that this is territory that you're going to be exploring. So don't spring it on them 3 meetings in, headline it well ahead of time. So for me, when I work with a client, it sounds something like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, I believe my job is to help you use money as a tool to live the best version of your lives you possibly can. And to do this well, I find it helpful to dedicate some time in the beginning to exploring big picture questions around values and purpose. And then here is where I really think it's important to add a dose of excitement. Many of my clients find this to be their favorite part of the entire process. And if you're up for having these conversations, I can promise you the advice I give you will be more personalized and more relevant to your situation.
I love that right there. And one of the things, it's like clients can smell fear, right? Like,
oh yeah,
clients can smell fear. So it's this is part of what I say to the advisors that we serve is like, look, money touches every part of our lives. It's a very natural thing to say, hey, I'm going to help draw out your dream life. That's part of the process. And money touches your ability to live or not live that dream life. I wouldn't be serving you well if we didn't have this conversation. And if you say that with a modicum of conviction, I think it makes absolute sense. It's when we're hemming and hawing and we're apologetic and we're looking at the floor and sort of uncertain of ourselves that I think clients go, what is going on here? Because when you articulate it the way that you just did, it's the most sensible thing in the world that how else would you do it? At the risk of a massive digression, like right before we had this conversation, friend of the show and former guest, Eben Burr, sent me a clip of a video, and it was called Perfume Quest. And it was this perfume, it was a guy who makes perfume and cologne. And he asks people about the most meaningful thing that's ever happened to them. And then he creates a scent to evoke the memory of that thing. And this one that Evan sent me was with one of our favorite musical artists, the lead singer of the band Idols, talks about this incredible experience he had. I won't spoil it. Go check it out. And this guy who was this utter craftsman goes to the ends of the earth to create a scent for him that is evocative of the most meaningful moment in this man's life. And I'm sitting here listening to this going, why can't we build portfolios this way? And I think this is what you're advocating for, right? Is drawing out, eliciting something deeper in them and creating a plan and a portfolio that corresponds with that. How else would you ever do it? And we have to sell that this is the way, right? We're not stock pickers in isolation. This is the way. There's no other way. And if I didn't have this conversation with you, it would be a massive disservice.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what is a portfolio if not an engine for a good life, right?
Yeah. So another thing that stuck out to me in our preparation for this conversation is you talked about the role of purpose in this whole process as a regret minimization framework, just something that, as a behavioral guy, I'm always on the hunt for. What is the role of all the things we're talking about today in regret minimization?
So if we think back to Carl's definition that we talked about earlier of capital being time, money, energy, and attention, and like I said, he visualized this as a Venn diagram, use of capital on one side, what's most important to you on the other. The space in between those two circles, to the extent that there is space, and I think there is for pretty much all of us at certain times, that's the breeding ground for regret. The more we get those circles to overlap, the less room there is for regret to take root. I'm curious, Daniel, have you ever read a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying by Bronnie Ware?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. So I think back to that book. I think she was a palliative care nurse. I know she worked in palliative care. And she had the privilege of being with all these people on their deathbeds. And what was the number one regret? Well, it was, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life that was true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I have yet to find a better call to action for this type of work.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I've written about it. I believe I've talked about it on this show. I was sitting in this chair in this room, pulling my hair out over some Excel formula I was getting wrong. And I was legitimately so upset. Like, I mean, if you had asked me how my day was going, I would have quite dramatically told you, I'm having a terrible day. And then my wife comes down and tells me that my sister-in-law, who was in her early 30s, is about to die, right? Like she's about to die. And you have this moment where everything you've worried about is so stupid. Like, and it's brought with perfect clarity, perfect lucidity. You know what matters, you know what doesn't, and you retain that for a moment in time, right? You retain that for a moment in time, and then you lose it if you're not revisiting ideas like Bronnie Ware's 5 Regrets of the Dying, right? It's so easy to get swept up in the tide of every day and live a life that is so small, right? To live a life that is so small and so petty and so wrapped up in the wrong things, if we're not constantly revisiting these ideas and revisiting these regrets that we may have. And money is the thing that tends to loom largest in our minds if we're not constantly fighting against that, right? Mm-hmm. And advisors are the ones to have that conversation. Advisors are the ones to say, money is a tool. It is not the measure of a life, right? Money is a tool. It's not the measure of a life. No one else is going to have that conversation with their with your clients, because society is going to tell them money is everything. A capitalist society has a vested interest in teaching you that money and consumption are what it's all about. And if we aren't working with our clients, who will? So I love this as a regret minimization framework. I think about like a risk tolerance questionnaire, and you need to revisit this periodically, right? To sort of refresh this. When you think about the process that you and your co-authors have articulated here, how often does this process need to be revisited, this drawing out of financial purpose?
Well, I think there's a few ways to answer that question. One simple one would just simply be every couple of years or anytime a big decision needs to be made. I think big decision, those key inflection points, and that could be, do I take this job or that one? Do we upgrade to this bigger house? Do I take a sabbatical to take a world trip with the kids? These are all the big decisions I'm talking about. And that's a really good time to revisit the work that you've done around money and purpose. But I also think of it almost like an oil change. So if a couple of years has gone by and you haven't had that conversation, you haven't revisited the work you've done previously, it's probably a good time to do it, much like we would update an estate plan every few years. I do think, one artifact that comes from this work is that statement of financial purpose that we talked about. And I think that should almost be revisited daily. If you have that visible somewhere, like on a bathroom mirror, or at the very least, if your planner has it visible at the top of agendas, or maybe at the top of the financial plan, or they have it in their CRM, so it's at least top of mind for them, and it reminds them to bring it up with clients. I think that's great. And as for whether or not our sense of our values and our sense of purpose change, my sense of that is yes, that a lot of them do. Some of them don't. I think especially once you have kids and once you have a spouse, that family value that is so real and present for most of us, that one's probably not going away. That one's probably pretty evergreen. The way we express it might change over time. But our sense of purpose, I think, very much can change depending on what chapter of life we're in. I'm curious for you, Daniel, do you feel like your sense of purpose has changed over the years as your career and your family life has evolved?
Well, I think there are parts of it that are unchanging and parts of it where one thing is more or less at the foreground, right? So the study of purpose, really, and helping others find theirs is a consistent theme in my life. And I feel like it's only in very recently that I've really tackled that sort of at the level that I should have. So I'm happy that I kind of am finally narrowing the divide between my stated values and how I'm spending my time. But then certainly, you know, children, right? Like, I mean, they, as a newlywed, having quality experiences with my wife and sort of getting to know her better and forming a strong foundation would have been sort of my ultimate relational purpose. You know, right now, my wife and I are a team in trying to raise 3 productive members of society. And then, you know, we're only a couple years out from one of them heading out of the nest. And so I imagine as that continues to happen, you're always going to be a parent, right? They'll always matter to you, but the specific ways that gets implemented and what that looks like financially change dramatically. So I can really see what you're talking about, right? Like one of the reasons I think you pull out those values is because values tend to endure, but the specific implementation of those values from a financial perspective, I think will shift rather dramatically over the lifespan. So that's where I think the oil change gets good, and hopefully people will do this more often than I get an oil change, which is, you know, not
same,
not enough. You know, the last sort of formal question, did you come across any interesting findings or research or philosophy around how this process might, you know, make advisors happier, lead to greater client engagement, make clients happier? What sort of, if people are on the fence or they're skeptical about this and it sounds good, but they're not sure of the ROI of it, what would you do to kind of tip the scales for them?
Sure. Yeah. Here's my pitch for why it's worth having these conversations. So always want to lead with the benefits to the clients. For clients, I think when they come to us, one of the things they seek most is clarity. And I think going through these conversations can be incredibly clarifying. And also, if it's done well, they leave with this feeling that they've been truly heard and truly listened to, which I think is just an incredibly rare and powerful feeling. If you're working with a couple, these conversations can lead to a level of shared understanding and connection that just may not have been within reach without these conversations. One idea that I love also is that when we establish a sense of purpose around our money, it creates this idea of a personal benchmark, which I know is something you've written about a lot. You know, the idea of how the S&P is doing just doesn't matter as much when you can measure your progress against this deeper sense of purpose. You know, it's not that we don't want to pay attention to how the S&P is doing, but it's not the end all be all as a benchmark. And finally, on the client side of things, I think really motivation and persistence, you know, and this kind of gets into the advisor benefits as well. We love to have clients who are motivated and take our advice and take action. Well, I think clients who have rooted what they're doing in a sense of purpose are likely to be more motivated and persistent. So that's on the client side. Any thoughts there before I share some benefits to the advisor?
Oh, I'm completely on board, and I like starting. I like starting with the client too. I think that's the right mindset.
Yeah. Well, on the advisor side, I think there's plenty of benefits as well. And I always go back to this advice I got when I first entered the industry. The job itself was dreadful, but I had a great manager. And the advice they gave me was, you know, sometimes you have to slow down to speed up. And the context in which they gave me that advice was, you know, my job was to answer 1-800 phone calls at this big discount brokerage firm and try to refer people to financial advisors within the firm and persuade them that meeting was worth having. And I was just terrible at it in the beginning because I thought it was a numbers game. I thought it was, let's just have as many of these conversations as I possibly can, just move quickly through them. And if I take enough of these calls, then the results will come. And what I learned is that by slowing down and really actually getting to know people and understanding what was important to them, then I could really have a lot more credibility when I was giving a referral for them to talk to an advisor, and they were much more likely to take my advice in doing that. And that was a really important lesson for me. And the way I tie it in here is that, you know, there's always this sense that if we slow down our practice to have these types of conversations, that we're being less efficient. I would argue we're being more efficient. And the reason for that is my experience has been these types of conversations make for more loyal clients. So if your clients are loyal and they're not leaving you, that's less business generation you have to do later on. It's better retention. It also leads to more referrals. So clients who have this experience of being, deeply heard, and that they're having conversations that they're not having anywhere else, they want to recommend that experience to their friends and family. And also, selfishly, it's just more fun. It's just way more fun to approach work this way. And so regardless of any sort of financial dividends or retention dividends it might pay, it's just a really great way to approach the job in my experience.
Yeah. Well, you heard it. If it works on an inbound 1-800 hotline, you can do it in your practice too. So as we close out here, a frequent soapbox of mine. So I asked my kids, this was an interesting exercise. I asked my kids recently, I said, like, what have you learned at home? Basically, it was basically like, what do mom and dad always say? What are sort of the messages that we reinforce to you? And most of them were pretty, look, I was thrilled, I was happy, but it's like pretty, be kind to people you meet. Remember, there's other people in the world, and your actions, your actions influence their, the day they're having, and things like that. Like, good, teaching them to be, thoughtful, move through the world in a thoughtful way. But there was one that kind of surprised me, and it was something to the effect of like, we spend money on things that create the kind of world we want to see. And I think it was specifically in regards to going to little maker fairs and farmers markets and things like that. And we're big spenders at the farmers market, because I say, look, I'll pay double for this corn or these zipper peas or whatever, because I want to live in a world where local farmers can feed their family, right? Like I'm willing to use my money to create the world I want to create. So my soapbox here is, if you're a listener to my podcast, if you're a reader of my books, and you're into this whole human first movement we've got going in financial planning, I think you want to support creators like Andy. So Andy, with that, tell us about where we can find the course and how people can learn more about it.
That's so generous, Daniel. Thank you. So a couple ways. You can go to our website, which is SOFP, as in Statement of Financial Purpose, .offthebalancesheet.com. So once again, that's SOFP.offthebalancesheet.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. Again, my name's Andy, last name Baxley, spelled B as in boy, AXLEY. Or feel free to email me directly. As you hopefully can tell, I really love talking about this stuff, and welcome anybody reaching out to talk about it further. So you can reach me at hello@andybaxley.com.
All right. Andy, I learned a lot today. Thank you, my friend. This was great.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Great to be here.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.